This is an electric scooter, and depending on where you live, you can probably find one on the street, rent it, and ride it around town. But this is an S1X eSkootr, an electric racing scooter that's used to race in a real competitive format. Now, the eSkootr Championship may look like a joke at first, but it genuinely is a real motorsport series. I first noticed it while seeing it on Instagram nearly 3 years ago, and it was pretty heavily memed on in the comments, which I'll admit were pretty funny, but I thought, why not give it a try now? I personally love motorsport, but my horizons are probably not as broad as they should be. I started by watching Formula Drift, then Formula 1, then IndyCar, and the addiction continued, but I've never really watched a two-wheel series. I know MotoGP is huge, but my passion for motorsport really came from loving cars when I was younger, so it never really appealed to me in the same way that other series did. So why not start with the most pedestrian series possible, scooters? Now, prior to watching this series, I'm doing a little bit of research so I know what I'm getting myself into. The series was originally introduced in 2022, and it was put on a hiatus after that, but was announced for a comeback in the 2024-2025 years. But no matter how much digging I do, I just can't find any information of the return. Their Instagram page went MIA after rider announcements, and their website has no information regarding anything but 2022. So that's the year I'm going to watch. The series consisted of 10 teams, with 3 riders apiece. Teams you might recognize include Carlin, 6 Series Racing owned by Fabio Wibner, 27X owned by Nico Hulkenberg, and 258 Racing owned by Anthony Joshua. To start at the league, the riders are selected in a draft process where the 10 teams selected 3 riders out of a huge pool, taking turns rather than a traditional contract system usually followed in motorsport. But 30 riders on a tiny course does seem like a lot. So they use a format where they use 5 4 to 9 lap heat races of 6 riders each, and each time the bottom 2 are eliminated, and it keeps going with the still available riders as it whittles down until the final 6 and the final race. Meaning to win the event, you can in theory get third in every heat, but win the last race and steal away the dub. But as you go through those heats, you accumulate points. Now finally, the last part to know is about the scooters themselves. They were specifically built for this series by Ycom, an Italian company who's made bodywork parts for Formula 1 and plenty of other racing domains. They included twin 6kW motors that were developed by Williams, yes, the same as the F1 team, as well as 6.5-inch wheels, carbon fiber bodywork, and a 35kg frame capable of 50 degrees of lean, and 100 km an hour, or 62 miles per hour if you talk in freedom units. They also had a push-to-pass boost system, which elevated speed, and it was limited to a certain amount per race. Those few things are all you really need to know going into it, because that's also all I know heading into watching it. So let's head into the season and find out what really made the series disappear. First came round 1 of the 6-round season, taking place in London. Now the first thing to notice before the race even starts is that because there's no qualifying, the riders start on this ramp and go down it at the beginning of every race. It's a decent idea, but it largely decides what goes on in these short races. Because each heat is so short in terms of laps, if you get a good start and catapult up to first, it's almost guaranteed that you'll finish either first or near to it. It also had its fair share of crashes off the rip from collisions of drivers starting too close or simply just wobbling off the ramp itself near the start. As this was my first taste of seeing things happen, there are naturally more impressions in this first round over the racing as a whole. And don't get me wrong, there were plenty of overtakes happening, and a majority of them came on the straights, but most of the ones that weren't on the straights were just results of errors from others. You get a few strategic dives in low speed corners, and the actual close racing makes the term elbows out a bit too real. But one thing I will say is it looks really cool to see these scooters ride up on the apex and leaning into these tight, nitpicky corners. In a way, it reminded me when I was younger riding a ripstick on how you have to lean into each turn and whatnot. And that nostalgic feeling honestly made me enjoy watching it quite a bit. And the utilized POV camera made it look a lot cooler than the broadcast camera that was at the corners. The only other real takeaway I had from round 1 was that everything did just seem to be a bit low stakes. Slow corners meant overtakes were subpar, and if you crash, you can just get up and keep going without any real penalty, and it did overall make these individual moments in the race feel a bit meaningless. The final roundup on Event 1 was that it was won by Player 1 rider Matisse Neyrud. Now heading into round 2, my expectations had been exceeded so far, as it's more than just some silly parking lot shenanigans you'd have with your friends on some scooters, and imperfections would be bound to happen in the first year of a series. So they actually worked to combat that in the very next round in Sion, Switzerland. For round 2, heats went from 6 riders to 5, meaning only the last placed rider in each heat would be eliminated. As a whole, the event was very similar to the London round, as it was completely outdoor and a street race where the same things kind of occurred. Crashes and snowballing wins off the starting ramp still took place, and the heat rounds and pretty much everything up till the final rounds were just chaos. Crash after crash after crash meant that if you were out of trouble, you would move on, and it honestly made for a bit of a dull watch. But one thing that was on the broadcast did catch my attention. When talking about backgrounds of the riders, the commentators mentioned how one of them was a former hockey player, and it really got me thinking, how did they even find these people? Now, upon further research, you have people in here with backgrounds in motorcycles, BMX, and freestyle scooters, which makes sense, but you stray a bit further into backgrounds like figure skating, snowboarding, CrossFit, and the mentioned field hockey. In that way, it made me think about how this series may have failed to grow because no one's directly training to ride these scooters. Anyways, the wrap up on the round was that it was a win for Sara Cabrini, who raced for Helbiz. Now's the part where I would be going into the Italy round, but that never actually happened. Due to logistical issues, the Italy round got postponed and therefore postponed the other rounds, and eventually none of them happened. In the end, the remaining 3 rounds were replaced by 2 rounds, both taking place at the Circuit Paul Ricard in Marseille, France, after 5 months on break. This was the only time in the season where the races actually took place on a purpose-built racetrack, and holy did it make a huge difference. Now, one thing I can't comment on is if the heats were chaotic or not, because the broadcast didn't even show the first heats in round 3, and round 4 only showed the semifinals and onwards. But the racing that was broadcasted was a lot better. When you go from a tight, walled-in street race to an actual track with elevation change, an actual flow that allows for carrying speed through different corners, it's genuinely a night and day difference. These rounds actually saw good racing with well thought out overtakes, realistic racing you'd see in other domains, and a lot less careless crashes coming from poor track planning. This venue actually changed my opinion entirely of what I'd seen so far, going from being like, okay, I can see the idea, to wow, this is actually kind of good. I do believe if that the entire year were to have taken places at racecourses instead of town centers, it would have been 10 times better than what it was, but it didn't solve everything. The same issue with the starting ramp continued, with it compounding into results, and specific moments where crashes would not result in a single position lost, so it still was a bit befuddling. That being said, race 1 was won by Mark Luna of Murphy Scooters, and race 2 was won again by Sara Cabrini, making her the only double winner. But the championship was won by French rider Aymard Vernet, making him the only ever eSkootr champion. Now when you take a step back and look at the eSkootr championship as a whole, it's definitely not a complete joke, it was just a bit of an identity crisis held up by 2 6.5-inch wheels. On paper, the idea is a pretty cool one. You take an elevated version of machines that pretty much anyone can get their hands on, which made it a real novelty differently than anything else. It made an appeal to the audience by doing so because it's about as relatable as you can get to viewers in a motorsport series, as a fan can literally go out and get an electric scooter and have a similar experience to the actual people participating in these competitions. It also had close racing, literally as close as racing can get when riders are touching shoulders, and finally, the urban targeting was a great plan too. To race in London and Sion were great ideas, and they really heightened the opportunity to get people to attend these races in person, and the shift to Paul Ricard may have shifted away from that, but it had good racing, so it makes up for it. On the other front, the series didn't always do itself too many favors. The whole season was very poorly documented, with parts of the broadcast not being shown, or little to no information regarding schedule changes, to now announcing a comeback, and then ghosting the world when it came time to come back. When you lose the trust of the viewers who are the reason that your series can grow, it makes it nearly impossible to ever see success. Also, making a top tier scooter racing series is just kind of a weird ground because no one's deliberately preparing to professionally race electric scooters. As I mentioned before, a background in motorcycle racing is common and a background in BMX is common, but eSkootr would never be someone's first choice, so it makes it hard to grow when prospects are so few and far between. Finally, I'm just not a huge fan of the race format given. Heat races are so short and feel very TikTok brained in punching out as many races as you can instead of one big full race that actually develops. As a result, these heats don't really have any strategy either, which is a crucial part of racing in my mind, and given that the machinery is the same for every single rider, there really isn't a difference between any teams when you take out the strategy and machinery. As a whole, eSkootr was definitely an idea. It took micromobility onto a competitive level and had genuine novelty to it. But until an idea can balance novelty with actual high stakes, entertaining racing that's tailored towards fans, it's hard to ever see it as anything more than a fever dream.